Summer, 1812. Europe holds its breath. From the west, a colossal army begins its march. Over 600,000 men, from France, Poland, Italy, Germany, and more. All under one banner, all under one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. This was not just a military campaign, it was a message to Russia, to the world, that no one could defy the Emperor of the French. But history has a cruel sense of irony. As this army moved eastward, they weren't just marching into Russian soil, they were marching into the jaws of death. For years, Napoleon had dominated Europe. He redrew borders, toppled monarchies, and crowned himself emperor. But there was one enemy he could never conquer: Britain. To hurt Britain, he waged economic war. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, banning all trade with the British. But the system was flawed. Smugglers thrived, economies suffered, and in 1810, Tsar Alexander I of Russia defied the blockade. To Napoleon, this wasn't just disobedience, it was betrayal, and betrayal demanded punishment. He began planning the largest military operation Europe had ever seen. His plan? Quickly crush the Russian army, force a peace treaty, and return to Paris a hero. What could possibly go wrong? In June 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River. The invasion had begun, but already cracks began to show. His army was too large, his supply lines too thin, his maps were outdated, the Russian terrain unfamiliar and merciless. The Russians, under General Barclay de Tolly, avoided direct battle. They retreated deeper and deeper, burning towns and crops behind them. Scorched earth. Napoleon was forced to chase shadows while his men starved in the ruins of empty villages. The summer heat was unbearable. Water was scarce. Rotten food spread disease. Thousands collapsed from hunger or sickness. Desertion became common. Entire regiments vanished overnight. Napoleon was confused. Where were the Russians? Why wouldn't they fight? His army grew smaller by the day, but still, he marched forward, toward Moscow. September 7th, 1812, the Battle of Borodino. After months of retreat, the Russians finally stood their ground. The battlefield lay near a small village west of Moscow. On that morning, over 250,000 men faced each other. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, sabers clashed. The French attacked again and again, but the Russian lines held. Napoleon, usually aggressive, was strangely reserved. He held back his elite imperial guard, perhaps waiting for the perfect moment. That moment never came. By nightfall, the battlefield was soaked in blood. 40,000 men were dead or wounded. Neither side had won. But the Russians, under General Kutuzov, chose to retreat. Again. And Napoleon, he claimed victory, but it was hollow. His army was bleeding, his supplies were low, and Moscow was still ahead. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow. But the city he found was not a prize. It was a trap. The Russians had evacuated the city, leaving it nearly empty. Then, fires broke out, first here, then there, until flames consumed nearly everything. It is still debated. Was it arson by retreating Russians? Was it sabotage? Napoleon watched as Moscow, the jewel of Russia, burned for days. There was no Tsar, no surrender, no peace, only silence and smoke. Napoleon waited in the ashes of Moscow, 1 week, 2, then a month. But the Tsar never came. No envoy, no terms, only winter. By mid-October, Napoleon had no choice. He ordered the retreat, but it was too late. The Russian winter had arrived. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the roads. Horses collapsed. Men froze in their sleep. Clothing was thin. Boots fell apart. There was no food, no shelter. Russian Cossacks harassed the retreating army, striking from forests and fading into the snow. Dead bodies littered the road back west. Cannons were abandoned. Wagons burned. Men fought each other for scraps of bread. By late November, the remnants of Napoleon's army reached the Berezina River. It was frozen, blocked, and behind them, Russian troops. A trap. Napoleon ordered bridges to be built overnight, under fire in icy water. Thousands died trying to cross. Some drowned, some froze, some were cut down mid-stride, but a fraction made it. What had begun as a glorious march ended as a nightmare. Of the 600,000 men who had invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest were dead, captured, or lost forever. Europe was stunned. Napoleon was wounded, not just in numbers, but in myth. The man who once seemed invincible had met his match. Not in battle, not in politics, but in Russia. The cost of ambition. By the time Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812, the weight of his defeat hung heavy. The legend of the invincible emperor had shattered. Europe had witnessed his folly. The world had watched his destruction. What had gone wrong? Napoleon had been driven by his thirst for dominance. He believed that nothing could stop him. Not armies, not kings, not even nature itself. But in Russia, he had found the one adversary that could. The Russian winter. A force that had toppled more than one conqueror in the past. A force that had crushed Napoleon's hopes, his dreams, and his very soul. Napoleon's defeat in Russia was more than just military failure. It was the beginning of his empire's downfall. Europe had watched as the French emperor marched across continents, but now they began to move against him. The Sixth Coalition, an alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Sweden, and Austria. They saw Napoleon's weakness, and they struck. The war raged on, but Napoleon's strength was gone. His resources were depleted, his men broken and weary. In April 1814, after a series of crushing defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. He was exiled to the island of Elba, where he would remain for just under a year. But Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France. The 100 Days had begun. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Napoleon might reclaim his empire. But at the Battle of Waterloo, he met his final defeat. The Sixth Coalition crushed him for good. Napoleon was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the last years of his life. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5th, 1821, but his legacy would never fade. He had reshaped Europe. He had created the Napoleonic Code, a system of laws that would influence generations. He had inspired revolution, ambition, and ultimately, tragedy. His invasion of Russia was a warning, a reminder that no matter how great a general, no matter how vast an empire, the forces of nature, time, and fate are beyond any man's control. Napoleon's Russian campaign stands as one of history's greatest military disasters. Not because of the losses alone, but because it was a reminder that ambition, unchecked, can lead to ruin. It was the fall of a man, the collapse of an empire, and a cautionary tale for all who would dare to conquer the world. Napoleon's Russian campaign was one of the greatest military disasters in history. If you're interested in these epic tales and pivotal moments in history, don't forget to subscribe to the EpicPast channel. We're waiting for you to explore more mysteries from the depths of history in our next video. Remember, we cannot shape the future without understanding the past.